We need
Morning
safer
always
sidewalks
arrived
for everyone.
quietly in
I
Willow
have the
Creek
plan and the
Estates.
permits ready.
The neighborhood had been designed to look like the picture of perfection. Tree-lined streets curved gently around identical homes with spotless driveways, carefully trimmed hedges, and flower beds arranged with almost mathematical precision. Every mailbox stood exactly the same height. Every sidewalk remained free of cracks. Every lawn appeared freshly cut, as though nature itself had signed an agreement with the Homeowners Association. Visitors admired the neighborhood. Real estate agents praised it. Residents proudly called it one of the finest communities in the county. Behind the polished appearance, however, existed a different reality. Rules carried more weight than kindness. Appearance mattered more than understanding. And for some families, the HOA had become less of a neighborhood organization and more of an institution that watched every blade of grass while forgetting the people who lived behind the front doors. Among those families lived Daniel Carter. At 48 years old, Daniel had spent nearly 3 decades working as a city firefighter. His broad shoulders and weathered hands reflected years of lifting hoses, breaking through burning walls, and carrying frightened strangers to safety. He had never expected applause for doing his job. Helping people had simply become part of who he was. Every morning before sunrise, he walked across his front yard with a cup of black coffee, appreciating the quiet before another unpredictable shift. His lawn was never perfect, but it was always cared for. Daniel believed a home should look lived in, not displayed like a museum. His wife, Emily, often teased him that he spent more time talking to his flowers than watering them. Their teenage daughter, Sophie, loved taking photographs in the front garden every spring when colorful tulips bloomed beneath the maple tree Daniel had planted shortly after they moved into the neighborhood 12 years earlier. The Carter family wasn't wealthy. They weren't influential. But they were respected by neighbors who truly knew them. Whenever storms damaged roofs, Daniel climbed ladders to help elderly residents secure loose shingles. When heavy snow covered driveways, he quietly cleared several before heading to work. If someone's sprinkler system failed, Daniel fixed it. If a child lost a pet, Daniel searched until it was found. Acts of kindness filled his weekends without anyone asking. Yet kindness rarely appeared on HOA inspection reports. The president of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association saw neighborhoods differently. Margaret Holloway believed perfection required discipline. She had served as HOA president for nearly 6 years and treated every covenant, regulation, and landscaping requirement as though it were written into law itself. Her own lawn resembled a golf course. Every bush stood perfectly symmetrical. Flowers bloomed in coordinated colors according to season. She often reminded board members that property values depended upon maintaining standards. Some residents appreciated her dedication. Others quietly feared receiving one of her violation letters. Margaret conducted neighborhood inspections twice each week. Most presidents delegated those responsibilities. Margaret preferred doing them personally. She drove slowly through every street in a white SUV carrying a clipboard, measuring tape, camera, and printed copies of community regulations. Nothing escaped her attention. Trash cans left outside too long. Holiday decorations 1 day overdue. Faded shutters. Driveway stains. Grass exceeding the permitted height by even a few inches. Every observation became another official notice. Every notice carried deadlines. Every missed deadline brought financial penalties. Many residents complied simply to avoid confrontation. Daniel usually did the same. Until life unexpectedly changed. Late one Friday afternoon, Daniel responded to one of the largest apartment fires of his career. Flames consumed 3 floors before firefighters gained control. Families were trapped. Children required rescue. The operation lasted nearly 14 exhausting hours. Daniel suffered minor smoke inhalation and strained muscles while helping evacuate several elderly residents. He returned home after sunrise physically exhausted but deeply grateful that everyone had survived. His captain ordered mandatory medical leave for 1 week. Daniel reluctantly agreed. He rarely stopped working. 2 days later, another challenge arrived. Emily's father suffered a severe stroke in a neighboring county. The family immediately began making daily trips to support him during intensive rehabilitation. Hospital visits replaced ordinary routines. Meals came from vending machines. Sleep became irregular. Laundry piled higher than usual. The Carter family focused entirely on helping someone they loved recover. The lawn quietly continued growing. Spring rains arrived almost every afternoon. Warm sunshine followed each storm. Within 10 days, the grass became noticeably taller. Daniel noticed it every time he pulled into the driveway. Each evening he promised himself he would mow it tomorrow. Tomorrow always brought another hospital visit, another therapy session, another medical update, another exhausted drive home. The lawn remained unfinished. Then came the first violation letter. It arrived inside a bright orange envelope taped directly to the front door. No greeting. No expression of concern. Only photographs of the front yard beside highlighted sections of HOA regulations. Grass exceeding allowable height. Compliance required within 48 hours. Failure would result in monetary fines. Daniel quietly removed the notice. He sighed. The timing felt almost unbelievable. He considered calling the HOA office to explain the situation. Instead, he decided simply to mow the lawn after visiting Emily's father the following afternoon. Unfortunately, nature had other plans. Heavy thunderstorms flooded the region overnight. Lightning knocked down trees across several roads. The soaked lawn became impossible to cut safely. Daniel waited another day. The second violation arrived before the ground had even dried. This notice included a larger fine. Margaret herself had signed it. Again, there was no acknowledgement that unforeseen circumstances sometimes interrupted ordinary responsibilities. Only deadlines. Only penalties. Only rules. Several neighbors quietly noticed. Mrs. Alvarez, who lived across the street, understood exactly why the grass had grown. She had seen Daniel leave before dawn nearly every morning. She baked meals for Emily while the family spent long days at the hospital. Another neighbor offered to mow Daniel's lawn. Daniel politely declined. He appreciated the kindness but believed the responsibility remained his own. He simply needed one clear afternoon. That afternoon never arrived. Another emergency called him back to limited firefighter duties despite his leave. A warehouse collapse required experienced personnel. Daniel spent 12 hours assisting rescue crews. By the time he returned home, the sun had already disappeared. The next morning, Margaret conducted another inspection. She slowly stepped from her SUV. Clipboard in hand. Camera ready. She photographed the lawn from multiple angles. Measured the grass. Made additional notes. She never knocked on the front door. She never asked if everything was all right. She never wondered why a man known throughout the neighborhood for helping others suddenly seemed unable to mow his own lawn. Assumptions required far less effort than compassion. That evening, the HOA board authorized outside landscaping services to perform mandatory maintenance on the Carter property. The cost would be added to Daniel's account along with administrative fees and escalating fines. Margaret approved the order immediately. She considered the matter resolved. What she didn't know was that Daniel had finally arranged to mow the lawn himself early Saturday morning. He had borrowed a commercial mower from a fellow firefighter. The weather forecast promised sunshine. Emily planned to remain at the rehabilitation center with her father. For the first time in nearly 2 weeks, Daniel believed life might finally slow down enough to catch up. He set his alarm before sunrise. He placed work gloves beside the front door. He even fueled the mower the night before. Everything was ready. But before dawn broke over Willow Creek Estates, 2 unfamiliar landscaping trucks quietly entered the neighborhood. Their trailers carried industrial mowers, weed trimmers, hedge cutters, and leaf blowers. The work order listed only one address: Daniel Carter's home. The workers believed they were performing routine contracted maintenance. They had no idea the lawn's owner was only minutes away from stepping outside to handle the job himself. Nor could anyone imagine that what seemed like an ordinary landscaping assignment would soon grow into a conflict that would divide the entire neighborhood, expose years of abuse hidden behind HOA authority, and remind everyone that sometimes the tallest thing in a yard isn't the grass. Sometimes it's the courage to stand up against people who mistake power for righteousness. The first sound reached Daniel before the sunrise did. It was not the familiar chorus of birds greeting the morning or the distant hum of commuters beginning another workday. Instead, the deep growl of commercial lawn mowers echoed through Willow Creek estates, growing louder with every passing second. Still half asleep, Daniel sat upright in bed. For a brief moment, he assumed one of the neighbors had simply started yard work early. Then he glanced at the clock. It was barely 6 o'clock. No homeowner in the community was permitted to operate landscaping equipment before 8 in the morning. The irony escaped no one later. The very organization that enforced every neighborhood rule had apparently forgotten one of its own. Daniel pulled back the curtain. His heart immediately sank. 2 large landscaping trucks sat in his driveway. 4 workers wearing bright green uniforms were already unloading equipment. One mower had begun cutting across the front yard. Another worker was trimming bushes along the walkway. Without wasting another second, Daniel hurried outside, still wearing jeans and a plain gray sweatshirt. The morning air carried the smell of fresh-cut grass mixed with damp earth from the previous night's rain. The workers noticed him immediately. One of them shut off his mower. Their expressions showed confusion rather than confrontation. They believed they had arrived exactly where they were supposed to be. Daniel calmly approached the crew leader. Within moments, it became clear that no misunderstanding existed on the workers' part. The Homeowners Association had hired them. The paperwork authorized immediate maintenance. Payment would be billed directly to the homeowner through the HOA with additional administrative fees. The crew leader even presented the official work order. Daniel stared at the document. His address, his property, his lawn. Everything had already been decided without his knowledge. He looked back toward the mower. Nearly half the front yard had already been cut. The neat lines spreading across the grass should have looked satisfying. Instead, they felt strangely violating. Not because the lawn was being maintained. Because someone else had chosen to enter his property without giving him the chance to fulfill his own responsibility. Daniel took a slow breath. Years as a firefighter had taught him that emotional reactions often made difficult situations worse. He respectfully explained that he had planned to mow the lawn himself that morning. The landscaping crew listened carefully. The supervisor genuinely sympathized. Unfortunately, they worked under contract. If they stopped before completing the job, they would not be paid. If they continued, Daniel would receive a substantial bill. They found themselves trapped between compassion and obligation. Daniel looked at the men standing before him. Most appeared to be hardworking laborers simply trying to earn an honest living. They were not responsible for the decision. They were only following instructions. He could not bring himself to blame them. So he quietly stepped aside. The machines started again. Within minutes, several neighbors had wandered onto their porches. Commercial landscaping trucks were uncommon in Willow Creek. Even more unusual was seeing them working on Daniel Carter's property. Mrs. Alvarez crossed the street carrying a plate of homemade muffins she had intended to deliver later that morning. She immediately sensed something was wrong. Another neighbor, retired school principal Harold Jenkins, soon joined her. Word traveled quickly. People began gathering along sidewalks, exchanging uncertain glances. Many already knew about Emily's father. Most knew Daniel had barely been home. Several had offered help. None understood why the HOA had acted so aggressively. As the work continued, another white SUV slowly turned onto the street. Margaret Holloway had arrived. She parked across from Daniel's home and stepped out with her familiar clipboard. Everything about her appearance remained immaculate. Pressed clothing, perfect hairstyle, polished shoes untouched by the damp grass. She observed the landscaping crew with quiet satisfaction. From her perspective, community standards were being restored. Several residents watched her carefully. Something felt different that morning. The usual silence surrounding HOA decisions had disappeared. People were beginning to ask questions. Mrs. Alvarez approached Margaret first. Her expression remained respectful but firm. She reminded the HOA president that Daniel's family had spent nearly every day at the rehabilitation hospital. She mentioned his recent injury while saving residents from a devastating apartment fire. She gently suggested that perhaps a little understanding would have served the community better than another fine. Margaret listened. Her face revealed little emotion. She believed consistency required equal enforcement. Making exceptions, she often argued during board meetings, eventually destroyed standards. Rules only worked when applied equally. On paper, the reasoning sounded fair. Reality proved far more complicated. Equality without compassion often became another form of injustice. As more neighbors gathered, stories quietly emerged. One family remembered receiving a violation after returning from a funeral. Another elderly widow recalled being fined because high winds had blown tree branches into her yard before she could clean them. A young military family described receiving warning letters while the husband served overseas. Individually, each incident had seemed unfortunate. Together, they revealed a troubling pattern. Rules had slowly replaced reason. Fear had replaced community. No one had spoken publicly before. Now they realized they were not alone. Daniel remained surprisingly calm. He thanked the landscaping crew for their professionalism once they finished. The workers loaded their equipment with visible discomfort. They sensed they had unintentionally become part of something much larger than lawn maintenance. Before leaving, the crew leader quietly handed Daniel a copy of the completed invoice. Daniel glanced at the total. The mowing itself cost less than $100. Administrative fees, emergency processing charges, inspection costs, violation penalties. The final amount exceeded $700. He folded the paper carefully. Not out of anger. Out of disbelief. Across the street, Sophie returned from spending the night with a friend. She climbed out of the car smiling until she noticed the gathering. Then she saw her father standing silently beside the freshly mowed lawn. She also noticed the bright orange violation notices still attached to the front door. Her smile disappeared. At 16 years old, Sophie had always admired her father. To her, he represented strength, kindness, and quiet integrity. Watching him treated like someone irresponsible confused her deeply. She had seen him leave birthday dinners to respond to emergencies. She remembered Christmas mornings interrupted by fire calls. She knew exactly how many strangers owed their lives to his courage. Now she watched neighbors whispering while her father held an invoice accusing him of neglect. It felt profoundly unfair. That afternoon, Daniel attended the regularly scheduled HOA board meeting. He came prepared. Not with anger. With documentation. Medical leave paperwork. Hospital visitation records. Fire department reports. Photographs showing the severe weather that had delayed mowing. Everything was neatly organized inside a simple folder. Several neighbors attended as well. Some came to support Daniel. Others came because curiosity had finally overcome silence. Margaret opened the meeting exactly on schedule. The agenda listed landscaping compliance as routine business. What followed would prove anything but routine. Daniel patiently presented the timeline of events. Every date. Every circumstance. Every effort made to resolve the issue responsibly. He accepted responsibility for allowing the lawn to become overgrown. He did not deny the grass exceeded HOA regulations. Instead, he asked a single question through the evidence he presented. At what point had enforcing rules become more important than understanding people? The room grew unusually quiet. Board members exchanged uncertain glances. Some had never seen the complete picture before. Margaret had summarized the case only as repeated noncompliance. Context had never been included. Several residents then stood to speak. One after another, they shared similar experiences. Not dramatic stories. Not emotional accusations. Simple accounts of moments when compassion could have solved problems far better than penalties. The atmosphere shifted. For years, individual voices had remained isolated. Together, they formed something impossible to dismiss. The meeting lasted nearly 3 hours. By the time residents began leaving, one truth had become unmistakably clear. The discussion was no longer about one lawn. It had become about what kind of neighborhood Willow Creek truly wanted to be. Margaret returned home that evening believing the controversy would eventually fade. She trusted the regulations. She trusted procedure. She trusted authority. What she failed to recognize was that communities are built upon trust, not fear. And once that trust begins to disappear, even the most carefully maintained neighborhood can no longer hide what has been growing beneath the surface. The perfectly cut grass outside Daniel's home looked better than it had in weeks. Yet across Willow Creek Estates, something much more significant had begun to grow. Residents who had once remained silent were finally finding the courage to stand together. And by the following week, that unity would force the HOA to confront consequences far greater than an overgrown lawn. The Monday after the HOA meeting felt different. Nothing about Willow Creek Estates looked unusual at first glance. The lawns remained neatly trimmed, sidewalks were clean, flowers bloomed beneath carefully maintained trees, children still waited for school buses beneath bright morning skis. Yet beneath the neighborhood's polished appearance, something had changed. People who had spent years quietly accepting decisions they disagreed with were beginning to speak to one another. Neighbors who had previously exchanged only polite waves now stopped for longer conversations. Stories that had remained behind closed doors slowly came into the open. Daniel Carter never intended to become the face of a neighborhood movement. He returned to work as soon as his doctor cleared him. He visited Emily's father at the rehabilitation center whenever possible. He continued helping neighbors whenever someone needed an extra pair of hands. In his mind, the matter should have ended with the HOA meeting. But the community had other ideas. Mrs. Alvarez began speaking with residents street by street. Harold Jenkins contacted longtime homeowners who had quietly moved away over the years. Young families shared old emails documenting violation notices that had arrived during medical emergencies, military deployments, and family tragedies. Retired couples found photographs of repairs they had been ordered to complete even after storms had made the work unsafe. None of the incidents seemed extraordinary on their own. Together, they painted a troubling picture. The issue was never lawn height. The issue was judgment. Rules had gradually become more important than relationships. As more stories surfaced, several current HOA board members became increasingly uncomfortable. Many of them had trusted summaries presented during meetings without ever reviewing the circumstances behind each violation. For years, they believed the community simply required firm leadership. Now they realized they had only been seeing one side of every situation. At the next board meeting, attendance exceeded anything Willow Creek had experienced before. Every chair filled long before the meeting began. Residents stood along the walls. Others waited in the hallway. The atmosphere remained calm. No one arrived looking for a fight. They came looking for change. Margaret Holloway entered the room carrying her usual binder of regulations. She expected another emotional discussion. Instead, she found something she had not anticipated. Preparation. Residents presented organized timelines, financial records, maintenance invoices, photographs, and written statements. Everything was factual. Everything was respectful. Everything was difficult to ignore. Harold Jenkins spoke first. Having spent 35 years as a school principal, he understood the difference between discipline and fairness. He explained that rules existed to serve people, not the other way around. When rules stopped considering individual circumstances, they no longer built stronger communities. They weakened them. Mrs. Alvarez followed. She described Daniel helping her repair a leaking roof after a storm without asking for payment. Another resident recalled Daniel rescuing a family pet trapped beneath fallen debris after a tornado warning. A young couple described how Daniel shoveled snow from several driveways before reporting for a 24-hour firefighter shift. One by one, neighbors reminded the board who Daniel Carter truly was. The discussion was never about making him a hero. It was about recognizing humanity before enforcing penalties. Daniel himself remained seated quietly near the back of the room. He never interrupted. He never demanded an apology. He never asked for special treatment. His silence carried more weight than anger ever could. Then something unexpected happened. One of the newer board members requested a complete review of all enforcement procedures. Another suggested creating a hardship policy for families facing medical emergencies, military service, natural disasters, or unexpected crises. A third proposed requiring personal contact before issuing escalating fines. For the first time in years, board members openly questioned their own system. Margaret listened carefully. Her confidence gradually gave way to reflection. She had always believed she was protecting the neighborhood. She had never intended to cause unnecessary hardship. But intention alone could not erase consequences. Looking around the room, she saw disappointment instead of hostility. That realization affected her more deeply than criticism would have. After several long moments, she quietly acknowledged something she had never admitted before. Leadership required more than consistency. It required wisdom. The room remained silent. No applause followed. Only thoughtful reflection. A formal vote was scheduled for the following week. During those 7 days, residents continued discussing what kind of neighborhood they wanted Willow Creek to become. By the evening of the vote, nearly every homeowner attended. The decisions were significant. The board unanimously approved a new compassion review policy. Families experiencing verified medical emergencies, military deployment, caregiving responsibilities, natural disasters, or other extraordinary circumstances could request temporary extensions without penalties. Before hearing outside contractors, HOA representatives would be required to make personal contact with homeowners whenever reasonably possible. Administrative fees would be capped to prevent excessive charges. An independent appeals committee made up of volunteer residents would review disputed violations. Finally, the board voted to refund Daniel Carter every dollar he had been charged. Not because his lawn had complied with regulations, but because the process had failed to treat him fairly. Daniel accepted the reimbursement with quiet gratitude. He also made an unexpected request. Instead of keeping the refunded money, he asked that it be used to create a neighborhood assistance fund. The fund would help elderly residents, injured homeowners, military families, and anyone temporarily unable to maintain their property due to genuine hardship. The room fell silent once again. No one had expected that. The easiest path would have been personal victory. Daniel chose something better. He transformed an unpleasant experience into an opportunity to help others. Within days, volunteers began signing up. Teenagers offered weekend lawn care. Retired residents coordinated schedules. Local landscapers donated equipment. Several firefighters from Daniel's station volunteered their time on days off. The fund quickly grew beyond anyone's expectations. Before long, helping neighbors became part of Willow Creek's identity. Months passed. Emily's father completed rehabilitation and returned home. Sophie graduated from high school surrounded by neighbors who had become more like extended family. Daniel's maple tree bloomed more beautifully than ever, casting shade across the front yard where the conflict had first begun. Even Margaret changed. She remained on the HOA board for one final term. This time, residents noticed something different. Instead of beginning inspections with a camera, she often began with a conversation. Instead of immediately issuing notices, she knocked on doors. Sometimes she discovered someone recovering from surgery. Sometimes she found an elderly resident struggling alone. Sometimes a simple conversation solved a problem before paperwork ever became necessary. She gradually understood that communities flourished through relationships, not regulations alone. One sunny Saturday morning, Willow Creek organized its first neighborhood service day. Dozens of families worked together cleaning yards, planting flowers, repairing fences, and helping anyone who needed assistance. Children laughed while painting flower pots. Neighbors shared homemade meals beneath large tents. The atmosphere felt completely different from the quiet tension that had once defined the neighborhood. As Daniel trimmed the same front lawn that had sparked months of controversy, he paused for a moment. He looked across the street. Mrs. Alvarez was teaching children how to plant flowers. Harold Jenkins was repairing an elderly neighbor's mailbox. Several teenagers were mowing lawns for residents recovering from illness. Even Margaret was helping spread fresh mulch around a community garden. The neighborhood had not become perfect. No neighborhood ever could. Grass would still grow. Storms would still arrive. Life would still interrupt carefully planned schedules. But Willow Creek had learned something far more valuable than perfect landscaping. It had learned that compassion protects a community better than fear ever could. Years later, new residents occasionally asked longtime homeowners why the neighborhood seemed unusually friendly. Someone always smiled before pointing toward Daniel's maple tree. The story of the overgrown lawn had become neighborhood history. Not because of the grass. Because it reminded everyone that behind every front door lived a person carrying struggles invisible to passing cars. Homes were never meant to be judged only by what grew outside. They were meant to be places where kindness could grow within. The Carter family's lawn eventually became one of the nicest in Willow Creek. Not because anyone forced it to be, but because neighbors no longer waited for violation letters before offering a helping hand. And in the end, the most beautiful thing that ever grew in Willow Creek Estates wasn't perfectly cut grass. It was a community that finally remembered people matter more than appearances, compassion lasts longer than authority, and the strongest neighborhoods are built not by rules alone, but by neighbors willing to care for one another.